Have you ever wondered if the past can see the future? In 1947, when Europe was still trying to heal the wounds of war, an ordinary photo seemed to reveal nothing unusual. Until the viewer noticed a completely absurd detail. Decades later, the daughter of a former American officer, while cleaning out her father's attic full of memorabilia, accidentally discovered the photo. At first, it was just a black and white photo capturing a French countryside scene, showing a young soldier relaxing after a battle. But hidden behind that ordinary appearance, a figure that could not have existed at that time, made her tremble. From there, a journey to discover military mysteries, coded letters, and phenomena that science cannot explain began. In today's video, we follow in the footsteps of those young soldiers, uncovering moments when past and future accidentally intersect, and learn why some secrets, however powerful, must remain hidden. America was still nursing its wounds, the kind that medals couldn't mend, and time dared only to dull. Men returned from the war not just with memories, but with fragments of a world forever changed, pressed into old letters, folded into uniforms, and sometimes captured in photographs that refuse to fade. Tonight, we follow the story of one such photograph, an image so ordinary and yet so deeply wrong, that it would come to question everything we believe about truth, memory, and the quiet ghosts that linger long after the guns fall silent. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? We love hearing from those who, like us, find comfort in the quiet hum of forgotten history. And if you're ready to step deeper into the shadows of the past, don't forget to follow and keep your light close. You'll need it. The air was heavy that summer in rural Georgia, 1997. The kind of heat that made everything feel slow and half-remembered. Margaret Caldwell stood in her late father's attic, surrounded by boxes that smelled of dust and time. Her father, Lieutenant Colonel James Caldwell, had passed just 3 months before. 78 years of life packed neatly into cardboard medals, letters, maps, and a silence she didn't yet understand. The attic was her last task, the final frontier of memory. Each step creaked under her as if the house itself remembered more than it wished to tell. Her father's careful handwriting marked every box: service records, letters from home, photographs, MISC. It was that last one that drew her in. Miscellaneous. The word itself seemed to whisper. Margaret hesitated. Photographs had a way of reopening grief, turning absence into presence again. But the soft light from the attic window felt almost inviting that day. So she lifted the lid. Inside, hundreds of black and white photographs, each sealed in delicate sleeves. Her father as a young man, barely 20, smiling in uniforms too large for his thin frame. His fellow soldiers, arms slung around one another, eyes still full of hope. And landscapes, ruined cities, makeshift camps, roads that led nowhere but memory. Margaret found herself lost in those faces, seeing her father not as the quiet man who raised her, but as a boy standing on the edge of history. She almost didn't notice it, the one photograph tucked between two others. Unremarkable until it wasn't. It showed her father leaning against a stone wall in a sunlit field. His uniform was rumpled, a cigarette dangling from his lips. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, somewhere in France. July 1947. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But Margaret, ever the meticulous curator, looked closer. She studied the background with the same patience she used in museum archives, tracing every line, every shadow. And then through the magnifying glass, she saw it. Far in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the shape of a tall, slender tower of metal. A cell phone tower. Her breath caught. She blinked, leaned closer to the light. No, it couldn't be. Cell phone towers didn't exist in 1947, and yet, there it was. Standing quietly behind her father like a message sent from a future that should never have been captured. The technology wouldn't exist for decades, and yet, there it stood still silent, impossibly modern, captured in the grain of a photograph taken half a century too soon. Margaret placed the image on the dusty table beside her and exhaled slowly, her pulse drumming in her ears. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps a radio tower, she reasoned. Yes, there were radio installations in the 1940s. That would make sense. But when she leaned closer, hope faltered. The structure's design was unmistakable. The narrow triangular frame, the precise lattice work, the cluster of antennae crowning the top. It wasn't a relic of 1947. It was something from now. For the next hour, she sifted through every photograph in the box, searching for another crack in time, some hint that her eyes had deceived her. But everything else was perfectly ordinary. A young soldier's life frozen in the black and white calm of post-war France. No other impossibilities. No other ghosts. As the day dimmed and the attic light turned, Amber Margaret made a choice. A quiet, deliberate one. She slipped the strange photograph into a sleeve and carried it downstairs, not realizing that with that small gesture, she was opening a door that could never be closed again. Her father's study greeted her like a museum of discipline. Shelves lined with military history files, stacked in tidy rows, every surface, speaking of a man who believed that order could make sense of chaos. It was that same precision, that same hunger for understanding, that now burned in Margaret. She began to dig. His service records, once just paperwork, now felt like clues. France. June to September 1947. Post-war reconstruction. Documenting damage, coordinating rebuilding efforts. The dates matched. The location matched. Everything was consistent. Except for that one impossible detail that refused to be explained away. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page. Her father's handwriting, neat and certain, stared back at her. A man who never left loose ends. So why this? By nightfall, she knew she couldn't face it alone. There was one person she trusted, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, an old colleague from the Smithsonian. A man who could read truth in the shadows of a photograph. The next morning, Margaret drove to Washington, D.C. The photograph secured beside her as if it might shatter if she looked away. The city's hum felt distant, unreal as she stepped into the cool marble halls of the Smithsonian, a sanctuary of history and certainty. There, in a cluttered office, smelling faintly of dust and developer fluid, Richard greeted her with a kind smile. "Margaret, I'm so sorry about your father," he said softly. "He was a remarkable man." She nodded, returning his sympathy with a quiet murmur. And then with care, she drew the photograph from its case and laid it on the table beneath the magnifying lamp. Richard adjusted his glasses and leaned in. First with the naked eye, then through the lens. He murmured almost to himself, "Beautiful composition. Classic post-war framing. Your father looks young, maybe 20, 21. July 1947, Margaret whispered. France. He nodded. Yes, it fits. Lighting paper stock, the chemical pattern on the emulsion, all consistent with the 1940s. Then he paused, tilted his head, and for a long, fragile moment, said nothing. The room was silent, but for the soft hum of the lamp and the faint metallic sound of history breathing differently than it should. The grain, the tone, the way the light bled gently into shadow, everything about the photograph whispered authenticity. Richard moved the magnifying glass with practiced care. His expression, calm, his silence, heavy. Margaret waited, her heart pacing itself to the rhythm of the ticking clock on the wall. He studied the image the way a surgeon studies a wound, searching for the smallest sign of falseness, of interference. And then she saw it. That subtle change in his face, a furrow in the brow, a pause, the faint tightening around his mouth. He leaned closer. The magnifying glass trembled ever so slightly in his hand. Margaret, he said quietly, what do you make of the structure in the background? She drew a slow breath. That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, she said. To me, it looks like a cell phone tower. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He examined the image again from every angle and every lens, the way one listens for a whisper they don't want to hear. Finally, he set the glass down, and when he looked up, there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, a confusion, edged with unease. I've been authenticating photographs for over 30 years, he said softly. I've seen forgeries so subtle, they fooled museums. But this, he gestured to the image. This is genuine. The paper, the emulsion, the aging pattern, everything matches the late 1940s. And yet, he lifted the glass again. That structure, it's no radio mast, it's a cell tower. The design, the angles, even the antenna arrays. It's modern. But the photo was taken in 1947, decades before such things even existed. A chill ran through Margaret's veins. She had come seeking confirmation, but hearing the impossible spoken aloud made it feel heavier, realer. Could someone have added it later? She asked, her voice small. A prank, maybe. Richard shook his head slowly. There's no sign of manipulation, no double exposure, no retouching. The tower is part of the original negative. It was there in that moment when your father took the picture. He leaned back, removing his glasses, rubbing them absently with a cloth. A gesture of habit, or perhaps of nervousness. Then he looked up again, eyes searching hers. Margaret, what do you know about your father's unit? She opened the folder she had brought. 45th Engineering Battalion. They were documenting infrastructure damage, coordinating reconstruction. Infrastructure assessment, Richard murmured. Curious. Did he ever mention classified work? Experimental technology? Margaret shook her head. No. He never spoke much about the war at all. He always said some things were better left in the past. Richard nodded slowly. Maybe so. But I think we should dig a little deeper into what that past really was. I'll reach out to some colleagues, people who study anomalies in authenticated historical media. If this photo is real, it could be one of those rare cases that changes how we think about time and memory. Margaret felt a strange mix of excitement and dread rise within her. She wanted answers, but a small trembling part of her wondered if she was ready for them. Do you think, she asked quietly, that there's a rational explanation? Richard studied the photograph one last time. In my experience, there's always a rational explanation, he said. The question is whether our understanding of history is ready to hold it. The days that followed blurred together. Margaret, who had taken leave from the museum to handle her father's estate, now found herself lost in research instead. She read for hours post-war France experimental projects, forgotten engineering units. Every night she told herself she'd stop, and every night she returned to the photograph, unable to look away. One evening, while sorting through a box of her father's personal letters, she found them. Neatly bundled, yellowed with time. Letters to her mother, gentle, affectionate, reassuring. And yet, something else lingered beneath the words. In a letter dated July 15th, 1947, he had written, "We've been working on some unusual projects lately. I can't say much about them in a letter, but the things we're documenting here don't always match what we expected to find. Some of the reconstruction work is different than what they briefed us about back home." Margaret felt her throat tighten. Unusual projects, different than briefed. She read another dated July 28th, 1947. "I took some photographs today that I'm not sure I should have taken, but I wanted a record of what we're seeing out here. Sometimes I wonder if the history books will ever tell the whole story of what happened during the war." The words blurred in her vision. She could almost hear his voice, calm, measured, but carrying something beneath it. Something he had never said aloud. And for the first time, Margaret began to wonder if the photograph was not a mistake at all, but a message. The more Margaret searched the stranger, the threads became. Richard's colleagues had suggested something quietly unnerving, that her father's service might not have been as ordinary as the records claimed. That perhaps he had been part of something else. Determined to know the truth, Margaret reached out to the National Archives. As the daughter of a deceased veteran, she had the right to request his military files, even those once sealed beneath layers of classification. The process was slow, tangled in the polite machinery of bureaucracy. But Margaret didn't mind. She had learned patience from her father. While she waited for a reply, she dug deeper on her own. Through her contacts in museums and universities, she began uncovering fragments, whispers from the years after World War II. It seemed that the quiet years of peace had been anything but quiet. Behind the headlines of reconstruction and recovery, there were rumors of something else. Teams of engineers, scientists, and soldiers sent across Europe under the cover of rebuilding their true mission, hidden within words like research assessment infrastructure. They weren't just rebuilding roads and bridges, they were collecting, studying, reverse engineering pieces of German technology, and some claimed things that weren't entirely German at all. Reports surfaced of strange devices unearthed in the ruins of experiments that didn't make it into the official record. The documentation was fragmented, redacted, or missing entirely. But one thing was clear: there were places where time and technology did not seem to line up. And now, Margaret began to wonder, had her father seen something he wasn't supposed to see? Had his camera caught a glimpse of it, a truth that history later tried to erase? 3 weeks after her meeting with Dr. Hawthorne, the phone rang. A new voice, clear, composed and curious. Margaret. This is Dr. Sarah Chen from MIT. Richard Hawthorne shared your case with me. I've read his notes and I'd very much like to see the photograph for myself. Dr. Chen specialized in the analysis of historical technology, a scientist whose methods could trace the invisible fingerprints of time through chemical and digital analysis. If anyone could see what the human eye could not, it was her. Margaret agreed to meet her in Cambridge. The laboratory felt like something pulled out of another century or another reality. Rows of scanners, spectrographs, and instruments she couldn't name hummed quietly in the sterile light. Machines that could examine a photograph not just at the surface, but at the level of its molecules, measuring how the light once fell across a moment lost to time. Dr. Chen was composed, meticulous, a woman whose every motion suggested focus and control. She slipped the photograph beneath a scanner eyes, narrowing slightly as data filled the glowing monitor. This, she murmured, is extraordinary. Lines of analysis appeared on the screen. Chemical traces, density maps, microscopic detail. The image is completely authentic to the 1940s, she said. The grain, the silver halide composition, everything matches the era. But this structure? She zoomed in on the faint outline of the tower. This is showing properties consistent with modern materials, aluminum alloys that weren't even invented until decades later. Margaret felt the familiar unease return, that quiet pressure behind her ribs, the same as when she'd first seen it. Dr. Chen isolated the structure and enhanced the image, revealing the tower in stark, ghostly precision. The design suggests a telecommunication structure built no earlier than the 1980s, she said softly. More likely the 1990s. Maybe even the early 2000s. Margaret stared at the screen, at the clean lines of steel and wire that should not have existed in her father's world. The longer she looked, the less sense any of it made. Dr. Chen, she whispered, is there any possible explanation? Could it be a reflection or a double exposure? Or the scientist didn't answer right away. She leaned closer to the monitor, her expression tightening in quiet disbelief. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, as if she didn't want the machines to hear. Margaret. She said, I've been working in this field for 15 years. I've authenticated thousands of photographs from every era, every kind of camera, every type of film. And I've never encountered anything quite like this. She turned back to the photograph glowing on the screen, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the machines hummed. Only the past impossibly seemed to breathe. The evidence is clear, Dr. Chen said quietly. This photograph was taken in 1947. She turned from the glowing screen, her expression unreadable. But it contains something that should not have existed for another 40 years. Margaret felt her breath catch. The hum of the machines around them seemed to grow louder. There are only 3 possible explanations, Dr. Chen continued. First, the image was somehow manipulated in a way that our analysis can't detect. She paused. But given the chemical consistency of the film and the verified provenance of the photograph, that seems extremely unlikely. Second, there may be some piece of history we're missing. A secret military project, perhaps? Something involving experimental communication structures that by coincidence resemble modern cell towers. She hesitated, fingers still resting on the edge of the desk. And third, Dr. Chen didn't finish the sentence. Margaret's voice broke the silence. A third what? Dr. Chen looked up, meeting her eyes. Or we're looking at evidence of something that challenges our understanding of the linear nature of time. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy, absurd, and yet impossible to dismiss. What do you mean? Margaret asked. Dr. Chen switched to another screen revealing diagrams and data models that pulsed with color. There are physicists, she said softly, who believe that under certain conditions the boundary between cause and effect can blur. That information or even objects might move backward along the timeline, leaving traces before their origin. She paused, searching for the right words. It's speculative, of course, but certain experiments suggest that electromagnetic or gravitational anomalies could create localized distortions in time perception, even reality itself. The thought was absurd, but the evidence was right there in front of her. A verified 1947 photograph showing a structure that wouldn't exist until half a century later. Margaret swallowed hard. If that were true, what could have caused it? That's the question, Dr. Chen replied, almost whispering. Extreme electromagnetic fields, experimental technology, or something else we don't yet understand. When Margaret left the laboratory that evening, the air outside felt heavier somehow, as if the world itself had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly beneath her feet. 2 days later, an envelope arrived from the National Archives. It was thicker than she expected. Inside were her father's service records, ordinary at first duty assignments, performance evaluations, official letters. But halfway through the stack, one document stopped her cold. It was a classified mission report dated August 15, 1947. Stamped declassified, 1995. Her hands trembled as she read. The report described a special assignment given to her father's unit to investigate what were called temporal anomalies, unexplained occurrences reported in parts of post-war France. According to the report, Allied soldiers had stumbled upon evidence of technologies and structures that appeared to come from a different time period. At first, those claims had been dismissed, stress, confusion, fatigue. But when the sightings continued, higher command had ordered a formal investigation. Her father's unit was tasked with documenting the anomalies and determining their cause. The mission had been classified out of fear that the information could be weaponized by rival nations or that the public might panic if they ever learned what was found. Margaret read the document again and again, her pulse quickening with every word. Her father hadn't been rebuilding France. He had been chasing the edges of time itself. But the report ended abruptly with no conclusions. No mention of what the team had found or what might have happened afterward. Had it been connected to captured German technology, a natural phenomenon, or something that defied every rule of physics and history? She didn't know. But she had to find out. Margaret began searching for others' families of men who had served alongside her father, digging through veterans' organizations, dusty archives, and online genealogy groups. Somewhere she thought someone else might have seen the same things. Another photograph, another report, something that would tell her what her father had really witnessed in those strange fields of France and why so many decades later the past was still refusing to stay buried. The responses at first were disappointing. Most of the families Margaret contacted had the usual things: medals, letters, faded photographs of young men in uniform, smiling at a world they no longer recognized. Nothing unusual, but after nearly a month of searching, an email arrived that changed everything. It came from a man named David Morrison, whose grandfather had served in a unit strikingly similar to her father's, same region, same dates, same secrecy. David's message was short, polite, and strangely hesitant. He wrote that his family had long been puzzled by some of his grandfather's wartime belongings, especially a few photographs that, as he put it, never made sense. Margaret met David at his home in rural Virginia. He was in his 30s, a software engineer, with an analytical, almost cautious demeanor, the kind of man who double-checks every assumption before speaking. My grandfather never talked about his time in France, David said, guiding her into a small study lined with carefully labeled boxes. But these photographs, they've always bothered me. He laid them out one by one on the table. Black and white images, perfectly preserved fields, villages, bridges half destroyed by war, and then, unmistakably, the impossible. In one photo, sleek panels glinted across a rooftop solar panels. Another showed a tall, slender wind turbine rising above a field. And in the corner of a third, attached to a farmhouse, was what could only be described as a satellite dish. Margaret leaned closer, her hand trembling slightly as she brought out her magnifying glass, the same one she had carried since her meeting with Dr. Hawthorne. "These," she whispered, "these are showing the same anomalies I found in my father's photograph." David nodded slowly. "I thought maybe they were fakes. But the negatives are authentic, and they match every other photograph in the set. My grandfather wasn't the kind of man who made things up." Margaret told him everything about her father's classified file, the declassified report, and the word that had changed her understanding of his life-temporal anomalies. David's expression changed. "I think I might have something you should see," he said quietly. He led her to another room, smaller, darker, and opened a metal filing cabinet. Inside was a folder worn and yellowed with age. "This," he said, "is my grandfather's private journal. He kept it coded. I've tried for years to make sense of it." The entries were dense, with symbols, coordinates, and numbers lines that seemed more like mathematical equations than sentences. Margaret turned the pages slowly, noticing that the dates matched the photographs exactly. "David," she said, "I think this code might be based on military systems, possibly combined with astronomical data. If we work together, we might be able to break it." And so, over the following weeks, the two of them worked long nights filled with maps, charts, and the soft glow of computer screens. Margaret drew on her knowledge of World War II cryptography. David used custom software to test cipher variations against star charts and coordinates from the same dates. Then one night, everything fell into place. The journal's code wasn't random. It was a pattern based on celestial alignments, each entry keyed to the position of the stars and planets at the exact moment the photographs were taken. It was a cipher that could only be unlocked by someone who understood both military mapping and astronomy, someone like David's grandfather. When the code finally yielded its meaning, the words that emerged were almost unbelievable. "Operation Kronos, Field Observation Unit SAT-9. documenting localized temporal displacement phenomena. Anomalous projections observed. Future infrastructure visible in present landscape. Margaret read the lines aloud, her voice trembling. According to the decoded journal, their grandfathers had been part of a special task force assigned to investigate what they called temporal displacement events. In certain locations across post-war France, time itself had seemed to falter, revealing flashes, fragments, glimpses of the future. The cell tower, the solar panels, the turbine. They weren't fabrications. They were echoes of a time that hadn't yet come. And somehow, in the summer of 1947, both of their fathers had stood in the fields of France and seen tomorrow. The journal spoke of incidents both extraordinary and unsettling. The unit had repeatedly encountered glimpses of technologies that should not yet exist, moments in which the future had appeared briefly in the fields of post-war France. Some of these temporal windows had been photographed before fading, while others had left behind strange, tangible evidence fragments of a world decades ahead. One entry dated July 20th, 1947 described an incident that matched exactly the photograph Margaret had discovered. Today we encountered another displacement event near the village of St. Margaret. The temporal window appeared to show a scene roughly 50 years in the future. Several anachronistic structures were observed, including a communication tower of unknown design. Lieutenant Caldwell was able to photograph the scene before the window closed. The incident lasted approximately 15 minutes. Margaret felt a thrill tinged with disbelief. Her father had not merely witnessed history, he had captured the future. Yet, the entries also carried a darker tone. The unit had strict orders: document, but do not interfere. The military feared that even the smallest attempt to manipulate these anomalies could have disastrous consequences, but not all had obeyed. Some members of the unit had conducted secret experiments attempting to understand or even control the temporal displacements. The final entry, August 30th, 1947, was chilling. The experiments have gone too far. Morrison believes he can create stable temporal windows to access future technology, but the risks are too great. I have convinced Caldwell to help me destroy the research data before we return to the States. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Margaret and David stared at each other, the weight of their discovery settling like dust in the room. Their grandfathers had witnessed impossible events, documented them, and ultimately made a choice to suppress the knowledge, believing it too perilous to leave unguarded. Do you think they were right? David asked quietly. Margaret gazed at her father's photograph, young and resolute, capturing evidence of a world that should not yet exist. I think they were protecting the world from something they did not fully understand, she whispered. But now, the responsibility had passed to them. David nodded solemnly. Are we ready for what comes with this knowledge? As she drove home from Virginia, the decoded journal and photographs beside her, Margaret wrestled with the same questions her father had faced decades earlier. Had the devastation of war somehow fractured time itself? Were the temporal anomalies a consequence of chaos, trauma, and destruction, or the lingering remnants of experimental technology? The Allies never fully understood. Whatever the cause, she knew that her choice, like her father's, would shape the world's understanding of reality. She arrived at the house, her father's now hers, and carefully placed the journal and photographs in the safe, along with other artifacts documenting the temporal anomalies. She would preserve the truth, but she would not reveal it. The secret would remain hidden, protected until humanity might be ready. Margaret lingered a moment longer, looking at the photograph that had begun it all. Her father, forever young, standing in that French field, documenting the impossible. Now she understood why he had rarely spoken of his service. He had carried not just military secrets, but the burden of a knowledge too powerful and too dangerous to release. The photograph remained a window into a moment where past and future had intersected, where the boundaries of time had been thin enough to glimpse the unimaginable. Margaret turned off the study lights and climbed the stairs, leaving the mysteries of 1947 carefully secured in the darkness below. Tomorrow she would return to her ordinary life, but the knowledge she carried of a universe far stranger than most could imagine would never leave her. And one day, perhaps decades hence when the world was ready, the truth of those temporal windows and the courage of those who had chosen to guard them might finally emerge. For now, the secret remained safe, protected by those who understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage is knowing what not to share. The soldier in the photograph would remain forever young, forever vigilant, and forever guarding the thin, fragile line between past and future.